Society typically treats a return to substance use as a definitive collapse of character, yet addiction medicine treats it as a standard, predictable variable in managing a chronic condition. We have to remove the moral weight from the conversation to accurately understand the process. Clinically, a return to use is a recurrence. It involves losing cognitive and behavioral gains made during abstinence, and usually requires external support to interrupt. The clinical research confirms this reality. Between 40 and 60% of individuals in recovery will experience a return to use at some point. This bar chart places that 40 to 60% recurrence rate for substance use disorder alongside the recurrence rates for asthma and hypertension. The numbers align almost exactly. A return to substance use exists on a specific, measurable continuum. A single positive test does not invalidate the progress made during months or years of sobriety. To understand how that continuum works, we will look at the precise clinical differences between a slip and a relapse, map the multi-year risk timeline, and detail the absolute regulatory consequences under Department of Transportation rules. For a commercial driver, mapping out this clinical progression is the clearest way to prevent a single mistake from permanently ending a career. What happens in the hours immediately following a return to substance use dictates everything that follows. The specific label applied to those actions determines both the medical intervention and the regulatory response. The first distinct point on this continuum is a slip. This is a single, isolated, and often impulsive incident of substance use. Looking at this three-tier matrix, the first tier represents a slip. The individual immediately recognizes something went wrong and maintains their connection to their recovery support system. When use continues beyond a single incident, it becomes a lapse. Here on the second tier, the person has used the substance more than once. However, they have not entirely abandoned their recovery framework. Their support structure is still intact. In this state, the individual still actively thinks of themselves as someone in recovery. They retain the clinical capacity to interrupt the destructive pattern before it takes over. The final tier is a full relapse. This is a complete systemic return to the previous cycle of dependency. The defining behaviors shift drastically here. The use is premeditated rather than impulsive. The individual actively conceals obtaining and using the substance and purposefully withdraws from counselors, sponsors, and peers. These three categories function as distinct operational states. A slip might only require a call to a sponsor to stay on track, while a full relapse requires a total medical and regulatory reset. Accurately pinpointing which state a driver is in is the required first step to stop an isolated mistake from cascading into a systemic failure. Let's look at the exact moment an isolated slip occurs. We'll call this time zero. This timeline illustrates findings from a 2017 clinical study of 800 adults in recovery. It shows that the highest risk window for a slip escalating into a full relapse falls precisely between 48 and 72 hours after time zero. Within this 3-day span, the actions taken determine whether the event remains an isolated mistake or accelerates into a full return to prior use patterns. A separate 2021 study identified the main psychological factor that drives this divergence: recovery identity. Recovery identity measures how an individual internalizes their sobriety, whether they see recovery as a central, permanent trait of who they are, or just a temporary activity they are performing. A driver takes path A when they process the slip through the lens of deep shame. They interpret the mistake as proof that their recovery effort was never real. This belief forces the individual into silence. That choice severs them from their support structure and creates a self-fulfilling prophecy that accelerates the loop into a full relapse. Path B offers a different outcome. A strong recovery identity prompts the individual to process the slip objectively as a clinical event to be managed, rather than a moral failure. Both options, the choice between silence and disclosure, are only available while that narrow 72-hour window remains open. Surviving a slip is not a test of raw willpower. It is a race to reach out and reject the fallacy of total failure before those 72 hours run out. If we zoom out from those microscopic 72 hours, we can track how the clinical risk of recurrence shifts over a macro, multi-year timeline. Time itself is one of the most effective protective factors in the recovery process. A survey examining over 2,000 adults in recovery mapped exactly how this risk declines as sustained sobriety accumulates. This chart maps the findings, starting with the highest risk period. The data shows an immense concentration of risk early on, with 32.3% of individuals experiencing a relapse within the first 12 months. Moving into the second year of sustained recovery, the recurrence rate falls to 21.4%. By years 3 through 5, the figure drops to 9.6%, eventually stabilizing at a baseline of 7.2% after the 5-year mark. This specific clinical risk curve is the direct foundation for the Department of Transportation's safety regulations. The DOT requires a minimum of 6 unannounced follow-up tests in the first 12 months of driving, which a substance abuse professional can extend up to 60 months. The regulatory timeline aligns with the clinical risk curve. This testing schedule is built to align with the statistical peak of clinical recurrence, ensuring oversight during the period of greatest vulnerability. Because that testing window is so precise, any return to use during this period carries absolute consequences. If a follow-up test catches a relapse, or if a driver refuses to take one, the resulting penalties are immediate. This flowchart maps the regulatory reset protocol. The driver is immediately removed from safety-sensitive duties. The failure is reported as a new violation in the FMCSA clearinghouse, and a new evaluation is mandated. At that point, the entire SAP evaluation and return to duty process starts completely from scratch. There are no regulatory shortcuts allowed to bypass this sequence. While time is the ultimate protective factor against clinical relapse, the DOT testing timeline is an unforgiving regulatory net designed to catch anyone who fails to manage their condition. Understanding the data leads to a set of immediate, actionable directives. Knowing where you are on the clinical continuum dictates exactly what you must do next. If an isolated slip occurs, initiate this emergency protocol. You must reach out immediately to a trusted peer, counselor, or sponsor. You must break your silence within 24 hours. Waiting for the perfect explanation wastes time and allows that 72-hour escalation window to close. If a full relapse occurs during the DOT follow-up period, you must contact your substance abuse professional directly. Proactively disclosing a relapse changes the clinical posture of the case. Waiting to be caught by a random test simply compounds the regulatory damage. In both scenarios, the natural instinct is to isolate and go quiet. Acting on that instinct is the most dangerous choice a driver can make. It helps to look at the broader picture of long-term recovery. For over 70% of all individuals who achieve sustained sobriety, a relapse was a documented part of their timeline. Experiencing a relapse does not mean the individual is incapable of sustained sobriety. Instead, these events build what clinicians call cumulative infrastructure. Every attempt at treatment generates behavioral knowledge. When a patient re-enters recovery, they are starting from a higher baseline of self-awareness. A DOT regulatory reset sends your record back to zero, but it does not erase the cognitive gains you've made. Long-term professional survival depends entirely on leveraging those past mistakes to permanently secure a recovery identity.